Man insults Ronaldo on a first-class flight, instantly regrets it when the truth is revealed. The plane was already boarding when an older man in his 60s walked into the first-class section, looking around with a sense of entitlement. His sharp suit, gold watch, and confident stride made it clear he was used to luxury. As he reached his seat, he noticed a young man sitting next to him in casual clothes, wearing a simple hoodie and sneakers. The older man frowned, his lips curling in disdain. "They let anyone in first class these days," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the young man to hear. The young man, unfazed, simply smiled and nodded. The older man took his seat but kept glancing at him, irritated by his presence. "You must have won some lottery, huh?" he sneered. "People like you don't belong here. First class is for successful people, not some broke kids pretending to fit in." The young man turned his head slightly, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. The flight attendants continued helping passengers settle in, but the older man wasn't done. He looked the young man up and down, scoffing. "What do you do for a living, huh? You don't look like a businessman. Maybe you borrowed money to buy this ticket. Or are you just here to take pictures for social media?" His voice dripped with arrogance, his words designed to belittle. Other passengers were starting to notice, whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads. But the young man remained calm, simply looking out the window as if he didn't care. This infuriated the older man even more. "Oh, I get it," he chuckled darkly. "You're probably some football fanboy who spent all his savings just to sit here and pretend to be rich." The young man finally turned to him, his expression neutral. "Is that what you think?" he asked softly. The older man laughed mockingly. "Oh, I know it. People like you don't belong in first class. You don't even look like you have a real job." The tension in the air was thick now, passengers stealing glances, waiting for the young man's response. But instead of arguing, he simply smiled and leaned back in his seat. The older man shook his head, disgusted. Kids these days, no respect, no real success. Just dreamers wasting space in places they don't deserve. But what happened next would leave him speechless. The plane had now taken off, and the older man continued to glare at the young man sitting next to him. He couldn't understand why someone dressed so simply was in first class. He looked around at the other passengers, many of whom wore suits, expensive watches, and fine jewelry. Yet this young man sat there calmly, unfazed by his insults. The older man scoffed again, shaking his head. "You still haven't answered me," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "What do you even do? Or are you ashamed to admit you don't have a real job?" The young man sighed, finally turning to face him. "Does it really matter?" he asked, his voice calm and controlled. The older man smirked. "Of course it matters. First class is for people who have worked hard, earned their place, not some lucky fool who managed to sneak in." The young man chuckled lightly. "And you assume I haven't worked hard?" The older man rolled his eyes. "Look at you, dressed like that, sitting here all quiet like you don't belong. I can tell just by looking at you. You have no real success, no real achievements." The passengers nearby shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the way the older man was speaking. A flight attendant walking by overheard the conversation and paused. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked politely. The older man shook his head. "No problem at all. Just trying to understand how someone like him ended up in first class." The young man smiled at the flight attendant, silently assuring her that he was fine. The older man scoffed again. "I bet you don't even have a college degree. You probably don't even have a real career. What is it? Delivery boy? A social media wannabe? Or maybe you just got lucky gambling?" He laughed at his own words, proud of his assumptions. The young man only smiled, not taking the bait. "You sure have a lot of opinions about me," he said simply. The older man waved a hand dismissively. "I've worked hard my whole life, built a successful business from scratch. People like me deserve first class. We've earned it. People like you just waste space." At that moment, a group of passengers nearby exchanged glances. Some had recognized the young man but chose to remain silent, waiting for the inevitable moment when the truth would be revealed. The flight continued smoothly, but the older man's irritation only grew. He couldn't stand the sight of the young man sitting there so calmly, refusing to react to his insults. To him, wealth and success were measured by appearance. Fine suits, expensive watches, and an air of superiority. But this young man showed none of that. "Let me guess," the older man sneered, shifting in his seat. "You're probably one of those lazy kids who think they can just sit around and money will come to them. No discipline, no hard work, just dreams and excuses." The young man tilted his head slightly, still wearing that same unreadable smile. "Is that really what you think?" he asked softly. The older man let out a short laugh. "I don't think I know. I've seen people like you before. You probably follow football players, idolizing them, thinking that just watching sports makes you successful. You have no idea what it means to actually work hard." At those words, a few passengers turned their heads, now more interested in the conversation. Some of them smirked, while others shook their heads. They knew something the older man didn't, but he was too caught up in his arrogance to notice. "You know," the young man finally spoke again, his voice still calm, "success isn't always about wearing a suit or flashing wealth." The older man scoffed. "Spoken like someone who has none." The young man chuckled lightly. "And what do you do? What's your grand success story?" he asked, turning the question back on him. The older man straightened proudly. "I own a chain of high-end clothing stores. Built it from the ground up. I understand what it means to earn success." He smirked. "Unlike you, sitting here in a hoodie, acting like you belong." The young man nodded as if taking in the information. "That's impressive," he admitted. "Building something from scratch takes effort." The older man smirked, pleased with himself. "Exactly. That's why people like me deserve luxury. And people like you, well, you should be back in economy, where you belong." At that moment, a soft chime sounded, and the flight attendants began preparing for meal service. One of them walked past and suddenly stopped near their row. She turned, her eyes lighting up with recognition as she faced the young man. "Oh my goodness," she gasped. "I didn't realize we had you on board." The older man frowned, confused, as the young man smiled politely at the flight attendant. "Please, keep it quiet," he said with a gentle nod. But it was too late. The older man's face started to twist in confusion as whispers spread through the cabin. The older man frowned as he watched the flight attendant's excited reaction. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. The young man had been quiet the entire time, never boasting or trying to prove himself. But now the flight attendant's expression told a different story. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said in a hushed but excited voice. "I just didn't expect to see you here. I'm a huge fan." The young man smiled politely. "I appreciate that," he said warmly. "But please, let's keep it quiet." The older man's confusion deepened. He looked around and noticed that other passengers were now whispering among themselves. Some even took out their phones, sneaking glances at the young man. He shifted in his seat uncomfortably. "Wait a minute," he muttered, his arrogance starting to crack. "What's going on?" The flight attendant hesitated, then looked at him with mild surprise. "You don't recognize him?" she asked. The older man scoffed. "Should I?" The flight attendant covered her mouth, suppressing a laugh. "Sir," she said, shaking her head, "this is Cristiano Ronaldo." The words hit the older man like a punch to the chest. His mouth fell open, and for the first time he was speechless. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to catch up. What?" he stammered. "That can't be." But as he looked at the young man again, really looked, he finally saw it. The sharp features, the familiar smile, the unmistakable presence. He had been sitting next to one of the greatest footballers in the world the entire time, and insulting him without realizing it. His face turned pale. His confidence, his arrogance, all of it crumbled in an instant. I didn't recognize you," he muttered, his voice shaking slightly. Ronaldo simply smiled, his expression calm. "You never asked," he said simply. The older man's stomach twisted with regret. All this time he had judged Ronaldo based on his clothes, assuming he was poor or undeserving of first class. He had insulted him, looked down on him, and acted superior, only to realize he had been the foolish one all along. The other passengers were now fully aware of what had happened, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the irony. The older man's hands trembled as he gripped the armrest. embarrassment washing over him like a wave. The older man's heart pounded as reality sank in. He had spent the entire flight mocking and belittling Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the most successful athletes in history, without even realizing it. His arrogance had blinded him, making him assume that wealth and success only looked a certain way. Now his face burned with shame. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. I, I had no idea, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ronaldo remained calm, his expression unreadable. It's okay, he said simply. You made your judgment based on what you saw. The older man felt a deep sting in his chest. He had spent decades building his business, priding himself on his wisdom and experience. Yet in one flight, he had made a complete fool of himself. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words refused to come out. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. He shifted uncomfortably, then finally forced out, I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you like that. Ronaldo gave him a small nod. People judge all the time, he said. They see clothes, cars, jewelry, and assume they know someone's worth. But success isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. The older man felt the weight of those words sink deep into his chest. He had spent his life flaunting his wealth, believing that respect came from status and appearance. Yet here was Ronaldo, a man who had achieved everything: fame, fortune, legendary status, and he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The older man cleared his throat, desperate to ease the tension. I own a clothing business, he said awkwardly. That's why I assumed. Ronaldo smiled slightly. Nothing wrong with that, he said. But assuming things about people? That can lead to mistakes. The older man nodded slowly, feeling more foolish by the second. You're right, he admitted. I should have just treated you like any other person. Ronaldo chuckled. That would have been nice. The older man let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head at himself. I really messed up, didn't I? Ronaldo shrugged. It happens. The flight attendant returned, placing their meals in front of them. The older man hesitated before speaking again. Look, I just want to say I'm sorry. Really. Ronaldo looked at him for a moment before nodding. Apology accepted, he said. The older man exhaled in relief, but he knew this was a lesson he'd never forget. As the flight continued, the older man sat in silence, reflecting on his mistake. He had spent his entire life believing that success was something you had to show. Expensive clothes, luxury watches, and the finest seats in first class. But sitting next to Cristiano Ronaldo, a man who had achieved worldwide fame and fortune, yet remained humble and unassuming, had shattered that belief. He felt small, realizing how foolish he had been. For the first time in years, he questioned himself. How many people had he judged unfairly? How many had he looked down on simply because they didn't fit his idea of success? He sighed, glancing at Ranaldo, who was eating his meal peacefully, unaffected by the encounter. The older man hesitated before speaking. Can I ask you something? Ranaldo looked at him with a small smile. Go ahead. The older man cleared his throat. With all your success, all your money, why don't you dress, I don't know, more like someone of your status? Ranaldo chuckled. Because I don't need to. The older man frowned. But people expect it, don't they? Ranaldo shrugged. Some do. But I don't live for their expectations. I know who I am. I don't need to wear a suit to prove it. The older man leaned back, shaking his head. I've spent my whole life trying to show people I'm successful. Maybe I was doing it all wrong. Ranaldo smiled knowingly. Success isn't about what people see. It's about what you know about yourself. The older man let those words sink in. He had built his business from nothing, worked hard to achieve his dreams. But had he spent too much time chasing validation rather than true success? He exhaled deeply, feeling something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He smiled genuinely this time. You've given me something to think about, he admitted. Ranaldo nodded. That's a good start. The plane began its descent, and as they prepared for landing, the older man turned to Ranaldo one last time. It was an honor meeting you, he said sincerely. Ranaldo smiled. Likewise. As they exited the plane, The older man walked with a new perspective, carrying not just his luggage, but a lesson he would never forget. Never assume someone's worth based on their clothes, their car, or their lifestyle. True success is quiet, humble, and does not need validation. Treat everyone with kindness. You never know who you're sitting next to.